almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share.
Did it spark any discussion about taxation rather than philanthropy?
Most of the people in Davos, but also here on this channel, have been bought by the billionaire cults, you know?
And I hope this gets picked up, because you're a moron.
You can't handle the criticism, can you?
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. How one interview that was never even broadcast
But you're a millionaire funded by billionaires.
put tax reform on the news agenda. A news anchor in Israel learns the hard way about what can or cannot be said about the occupation and Israeli soldiers, like father, like mother, like son. Nicaragua, where journalism and politics can be a family affair. And citizen journalists have had their crack at covering the unrest in Sudan. Now the artists are doing their thing. This week, we're leading with one of those topics that television news producers would rather leave to print journalists, or better yet, authors, because it's complicated. It's about tax rates, and it's not a sexy topic, not a visual story, until a young Dutch academic spoke at the recent World Economic Forum in Davos and made news by telling a room full of billionaires, want to fix the global economy? Then dig deeper, pay up. It's time to tax the rich. Then Fox News' Tucker Carlson invited Rutger Bregman onto his program. Mistake. Bregman went right after Carlson, the channel that he works for, and the media in general for almost never covering the fundamental issue of tax reform. It's fair to say that Carlson did not take it particularly well. The interview would not go to air, but Bregman managed to have the entire exchange recorded on a phone camera. And once he sent it to Now This, an online news site, it was destined to go viral and get people talking. Our starting point this week is tax avoidance, global inequality, and the complicity of big media. The format is what's known as a double-ender, or a DTL, a down-the-line interview, which means the host is in one place, Tucker Carlson, at Fox News' headquarters in New York. The guest in another, Rutger Bregman, in a studio in Amsterdam. And it was pre-recorded. It wasn't live.
Rutger Bregman is the author of Utopia for Realists, and he joins us now.
Typically, if that kind of interview goes wrong, and the channel chooses not to air it, the video never sees the light of day, because it exists on the broadcaster's server and nowhere else.
I mean, you're probably not going to air this.
But this one went viral, obtained and released by the online site Now This. Because in addition to showing up with an agenda, Bregman had a plan. He brought along a friend to record the video from the Amsterdam end on his phone and to capture the audio from both ends.
It is a bit hypocritical, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
He knew that it was probably never going to be broadcast because he was raising issues that hurt them and make them look pretty bad.
You've been part of the Cato Institute, right? You've been taking their dirty money.
He was criticizing the fact that they are paid to represent a particular kind of ideology.
You're a millionaire funded by billionaires, and that's the reason why you're not talking about these issues.
What you got is the classic car crash TV interview, and I think that made him uncomfortable as well. But I think the thing that made him most uncomfortable was that he was accused of not being an independent journalist, that he was accused of working to a greater ideology that was also his paymaster.
I mean, many people have called for higher taxes, but very few
Well, not on this channel, is it? I mean, almost all of the pundits on this channel for years have been against higher taxes, right?
He didn't like that. He took umbrage with that.
You're all like, oh, I'm against the globalist elite, blah, blah, blah. It's not very convincing, to be honest.
Why don't you go yourself, you tiny brain, and I hope this gets picked up.
Even 20 years ago, this would have been unthinkable. The very fact that Bregman was able to get it out so quickly is itself a sign of the ability of different voices sometimes to break into the narrative and interrupt dominant interpretations of issues like, say, taxing the wealthy.
I mean, I don't know.
The down-the-line interview between New York and Amsterdam actually got its start in Switzerland. Rutger Bregman made waves in Davos, telling the World Economic Forum's well-heeled audience that the best way to fix the global economy was to hit them in the pocket and hard.
Come on, we gotta be talking about taxes. That's it, taxes, taxes, taxes.
However, Fox and Carlson would have been more interested in something else Bregman told his audience of billionaires, an observation that happened to square with Fox's own ideology.
I mean, 1,500 private jets have flown in here to hear Sir David Attenborough speak about, how we're wrecking the planet.
Perhaps Carlson's producers thought that Bregman would be a kindred spirit regarding the hypocrisy of billionaires flying halfway across the world. But Bregman doesn't come at this from that kind of position at all, the kind of conservative populist position that maybe Tucker Carlson or Fox News does.
But for me, what really stood out from that interview was the moment when Rutger accused Tucker Carlson of being a millionaire funded by billionaires.
You're not part of the solution, Mr. Carlson. You're part of the problem, actually.
That, for me, went to the heart of this debate about the role that media and well-paid people within the media potentially contribute to the debate or the lack thereof around tax fairness.
You're a moron. I tried to give you a hearing, but you were too annoying for me.
You can't handle the criticism, can you?
In Money Watch, a new report says the U.S. will fall.
The coverage of tax reform in mainstream news media is disproportionately low, while tax avoidance gets sporadic mentions when celebrities from the world of sports or entertainment are involved. Those advocating reform, like Rutger Bregman, tend to blame corporate media and the ideology of their owners for the shortfall. But the truth is a little more complicated than that, a little less reductive. Some of the media's aversion to tax stories, even corporate-owned media, isn't ideological, it's commercial. Channels not wanting to lose viewers by testing their patience and burying them in numbers, documents, deductions, credits, and loopholes.
You're right that reporting on tax can be dry and it can be boring. And 95% of that work involves reading very complicated spreadsheets, financial statements, and emails that don't make much sense. I do think that television has gotten much better, and there have been great examples at reporting on things like the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. If reporting on tax and financial crimes has taught me anything, it's that patience is a virtue.
I think by and large economic stories run pretty well on television. We have news walls, we have discussion programs. Remember that if you're talking about taxation, you're also talking about inequality, you're talking about poverty, you're talking about real people's lives. All that can be represented on television. I think what's happening at the moment is outlier ideas like radical taxation across the board.
Taxing labor income less. Yep. And taxing large accumulated wealth a bit more.
These were outlier ideas only a couple of years ago, but they're starting to take root now. And perhaps the media is having to rethink where it allocates space and time to those kind of discussions.
Commercial considerations are not the only thing the tax reform story is up against. Corporate ideology preaches that low tax rates are a good thing, that if billionaires are spared taxes proportionate to their income, society will somehow benefit. That's debatable. But what does trickle down is the trope that starts on the executive floor and winds its way below to the newsroom, where it becomes a journalistic truism, whether it is true or false.
For example, if a government cuts taxes, it will lead to increased economic growth. There is no evidence for that, and yet it's repeated as though it's true. It's not challenged.
The cut is a great thing because businesses, small and large, will owe less to the federal robber barons and be able to do as they see fit with their newfound hard-earned cash.
The problem with the media really is that there has been an ideological capture, and there is a kind of narrative that has become dominant. And one of the successes of neoliberalism is its invisibility and the fact that people are not aware, including journalists, are not aware that they're repeating beliefs that have no evidential basis.
Is there a cultural difference between mainstream media and the sort of voices we're now seeing in the general public and on the internet? Yes, there probably is. I think the media is only now coming to terms with the fact that people are challenging more bravely the status quo that even 5 years ago in a forum like Davos would not have been mentioned.
It's not a coincidence that in every project that we at ICOJ have done, be it Swiss Leaks, Panama Papers, or Paradise Papers, there is a pretty substantial number of media moguls, television station owners, newspaper owners, magazine owners, who appear, surprise, surprise, as using tax havens, as having secretive bank accounts. So the question is significant. Is there a way in which that economic pressure leads perhaps to the distortion of media coverage?
The better question may be, is there any way it doesn't?
This is my first time at Davos.
Rutger Bregman has recently made waves at two institutions, one a gathering of the rich and powerful, the other a news network.
I went to Davos to speak truth to power, and I'm doing exactly the same thing right now. But you're a millionaire funded by billionaires, and that's the reason why you're not talking about these issues.
Bregman made news by stating the obvious, that the rich should pay their fair share. Because sometimes it's not what you say that matters, it's where you say it. But the last word on this goes to the millionaire Fox News anchor who went viral. 15 million views and counting.
And I hope this gets picked up. I hope this gets picked up.
He didn't really mean that. We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Tarek Nafa. Tarek, starting with another interview that did not go well. The US-based Spanish-language broadcaster Evasion lands a face-to-face with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. What went wrong?
The interviewer Jorge Ramos did the interview at the presidential palace in Caracas, but it didn't last long, barely 15 minutes. According to Ramos, Maduro didn't like his line of questioning. After challenging him on electoral fraud, human rights concerns, and humanitarian issues, Ramos says he showed Maduro this video of 3 young Venezuelans eating from a garbage truck. Not only did Maduro then abruptly end the interview, Ramos and 5 of his colleagues were held by security services who confiscated all of their equipment, including the memory cards. The 6 of them were deported from Venezuela the next day.
Seems like some of the best interviews these days aren't making it to air. What are Maduro's people saying about this?
So the information minister, Jorge Rodriguez, tweeted that Ramos was a stooge for the US State Department. He said the government has welcomed hundreds of journalists, but that, quote, we don't lend ourselves to cheap shows. And to be fair, Richard, last week, Spanish journalist Jordi Ebule from the channel called La Sexta sat down with Maduro in an interview where he pulled no punches and nothing untoward occurred. We know there's history and geopolitics at play here. Caracas has reason to be suspicious of Western news outlets. Many have served up largely uncritical support for what some see as US attempts at regime change in Venezuela. The government has arrested or deported news crews from Chile, France, and Spain, but Jorge Ramos is nobody's stooge. His reputation is sound.
Moving on to Israel now, an anchorwoman there named Osharat Kotler taking a lot of heat over comments that she made about the occupation. What did she say, and why are people so worked up about it?
Kotler took aim at an institution that is seldom criticized on Israeli airwaves, the military.
שולחים את הילדים לצבא, לשטחים ומקבלים אותם חיות אדם. זו התוצאה של הכיבוש.
She was referring to a segment they had just run on Channel 13, a privately owned Israeli channel, about the beating of a Palestinian man and his son by Israeli soldiers last month. The victims were handcuffed and blindfolded, and the 15-year-old boy was made to watch as his father had his ribs and nose broken. The soldiers reportedly started dancing afterwards. So Channel 13 got thousands of complaints over Kotler's remarks. She received death threats, and the network has since assigned her a bodyguard. Israeli politicians, currently in the middle of an election campaign, seized on this incident. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tweeted about it, but his education minister, Naftali Bennett, went right after Kotler. You're confused. IDF soldiers give their lives so that you can sleep soundly. Apologize. Kotler did apologize on her show the next week, but she added this.
אני מצטערת מעומק ליבי אם דבריי פגעו במי מכם, אבל אינני יכולה שלא לראות את המחיר היקר שאנחנו משלמים דרך ילדינו, חיילינו, על מציאות השליטה בעם אחר.
Okay, thanks, Tarek. Last month, we reported on one of Nicaragua's most outspoken journalists fleeing the country. Carlos Fernando Chamorro, said he feared for his life, that he was facing extreme threats from the government. When civil unrest erupted last year against the government of President Daniel Ortega, Chamorro's news outlets, online and on the air, reported on those demonstrations and the crackdown that followed. More than 500 protesters jailed, more than 300 killed. This is not just a story of another crusading journalist. There's a lot of history here. Chamorro comes from an influential family. The Chamorros own media outlets. His mother is a former president, and his late father paid for his journalism with his life. That was back in the 1970s when Daniel Ortega led the Sandinista rebels. The political roles were reversed, and Ortega was fighting to get the story out. With one foot in journalism and the other in politics, the Chamorros don't just speak truth to power, they've held power. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on a family that lives and works at the intersection of journalism and politics in Nicaragua.
This is a story that spans generations, a family history of journalism interwoven with politics. A story about Nicaragua that is now being told online from Costa Rica.
Un país azul y blanco que sigue resistiendo a la dictadura y demandando verdad y justicia.
Carlos Fernando Chamorro heads up and presents Esta Semana, this week, one of his country's most watched current affairs shows. Last December, police raided one of his other media outlets, El Confidencial. A week later, they targeted 100% Noticias, another media house, and arrested its owner. For Chamorro, it was time to leave.
They raided our offices and occupied them. The military spy on us. Police have harassed us. My home was surrounded by checkpoints. Every time I had to leave or go back home, I was interrogated. The dilemma was whether to wait and be arrested on a trumped-up criminal charge or continue to report from Costa Rica.
Carlos Fernando
Chamorro is the journalist with the most credibility and most impact in Nicaragua. His journalism is heavyweight and is focused on the political and economic issues. A combative journalist that power finds uncomfortable, and not just the current government, because he has been critical of all governments of different political stripes.
What's happened to Carlos Fernando is an example of what's happening more generally. In December, Miguel Mora from 100% Noticias and his head of news, Lucia Pineda, were charged and basically kidnapped by the state. And they're still in jail. This is how the state cracks down on the media.
Chamorro has been reporting the civil unrest in Nicaragua since a wave of protests against the government of President Daniel Ortega destabilized the country last April.
Estamos pues ante la peor masacre de la historia de Nicaragua en tiempos de paz.
That's one reason why Chamorro is considered by the president to be persona non grata. But the other is in the name, Chamorro, the country's most influential family, both in politics and in journalism. 5 of Chamorro's forefathers and his mother have ruled the country, and today his cousin Juan Sebastián Chamorro is one of the opposition movement's leaders. The family also owns Nicaragua's main print outlets, including the oldest and most renowned newspaper, La Prensa. The paper's critical coverage of the crackdown led the government to impound its ink. And last month, La Prensa published a blank front page in protest.
That blank page really made an impression on all of us journalists. To see that a newspaper with such a long history in Nicaragua would need to resort to that form of protest against censorship. We really are experiencing a state of siege and persecution in the media.
It's a newspaper which has always been in opposition to power and one which has always had very good journalists. It is clearly aligned with an economic class, but that has not prevented it from doing the important work of watchdog journalism.
Media outlets like La Prensa have always behaved more like a political party than a newspaper. It has been able to determine who is allowed to be a presidential candidate, who is allowed to be a politician, the newspaper party. That's what I call it.
Moises Absalón has a dog in this fight.
Nuestra tierra ha sido insolentemente mancillada.
He's a pro-government journalist, a prominent voice on state TV. But he also has a point. For the past 90 years, La Prensa has been at the center of Nicaraguan politics. During the 1970s, as the 4-decade-long Somoza family dictatorship tightened its grip on power, Carlos Fernando Chamorro's father was owner and editor at La Prensa and the country's most outspoken opposition figure. Pedro Joaquín Chamorro was assassinated in 1978 by Somoza gunmen. Protests erupted, paving the way for Daniel Ortega's left-wing revolutionaries, the Sandinistas, to take power. Chamorro's widow, Violeta, took over the newspaper during the 80s and then the country, defeating Ortega in the 1990 elections to become president.
Pedro Joaquín Chamorro's legacy remains. His core values, which were about the fight for public freedoms in Nicaragua, are still a rallying cry. That's what journalists and ordinary people find so important about that story, one that sadly remains relevant to this day.
But what came after Pedro Joaquín Chamorro, which was no less influential politically, was just the ghost of what here in Nicaragua has come to be known as the Chamorrada, people who push their political interests through the medium of newspapers in order to set the government's agenda.
If La Chamorrada used their papers to wield influence, La Ortegada, Daniel Ortega's family, have taken to a medium with more reach, television.
Ahí salen los que provocaron la muerte, los que financiaron la muerte, los que han provocado paro. Quieren paralizar el país, fíjense.
Over the past 10 years, the Ortegas have bought up 7 TV channels, bolstered traditional Sandinista party outlets like Multinoticias and Radio Ya, and cut government advertising across non-Sandinista outlets. Because Ortega knows that political battles are often won or lost, depending on the media you own.
A partir de su regreso al poder, en 2006 y sobre todo...
When Ortega came back into power in 2006, he created TV stations and placed them under his children's control. Juan Carlos, Laureano, Camila, Morris are all involved in Channel 4, Channel 8, and then there's the state channel, number 6, which acts like much of the Nicaraguan state. In other words, like a feudal system linked to the presidential family. And then there is Channel 13, along with numerous radio stations. This all means that in the Nicaraguan context, there are practically no TV outlets that produce an aggressive form of investigative journalism. Nothing that challenges the exercise of power.
Ironically, Ortega and Chamorro were once on the same side. In the 80s, at the beginning of the revolution, Ortega led it and Chamorro ran its official mouthpiece, the Sandinista newspaper Barricada, or Barricade.
I was part of the Sandinista revolution. It had its successes and failures. In 1990, Sandinismo went into crisis and 2 paths emerged. One was a democratization of the left, which I followed. Ortega continued to believe in a one-party system, which meant authoritarian control. We're seeing the results of that now.
2 paths, 2 narratives. One that speaks of the socialist revolution, the other of social democracy. Times changed, families dug in. And today, the political battle in Nicaragua will, to a large extent, be fought through the media each side has at its disposal.
And finally, 2 weeks ago, we reported on the media side of the political unrest unfolding in Sudan and the information war taking place online. Social media feeds there have been flooded with images and commentary. Now come the contributions of Sudanese artists, also circulating online, primarily via Instagram. Artists like Abdul Rahman Al-Nazir, Khaled Al-Bey, and Ala Sartir, whose viral images center around the theme of freedom and dignity. Some of the artwork criticizes the Sudanese news media for their role in succumbing to the power of the state and failing to tell the story. We'll leave you now with some artistic impressions of a country in the midst of a power struggle. And we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.